But what's interesting about Israel as this laboratory for the world is any problem that exists is highly concentrated there. And if we can solve it there, that becomes the basis of a dynamic export economy. So I'm going to turn it to another end of the value chain at the early stage, and as somebody who's been a pioneer in this for a couple of decades now, we won't mention how many, but has been my dear friend John Medved, and his latest launch is one that is tremendously exciting, of another channel of capital in crowdfunding. So let's talk about that a little bit, how that works.
I want to accomplish two things quickly. One is I want to give you a further update on what's going on in the country, and then I want to talk a little bit about crowdfunding. If we can go to slide 22. Basically, last year was a banner year, the best year ever in terms of investment in Israeli high-tech, exits in Israeli high-tech. It simply was off the charts. If you look at the data, it was $3.4 billion invested in Israel. 85% of that came from foreign funds. If you look at slide 23, and by the way, before we go to slide 23, that was up 46% year on year from 2013 to 2014. So to imagine that this kind of increase happened in a year where we had 50 days of thousands of missiles landing on the country, airports shut down, up 46%, that's fairly amazing. Slide 23 shows the relative planetary alignment, if you will, of countries as they're represented in terms of number of companies traded in New York. As Yossi pointed out, we have a lot of work to do in our local market, but Israel has been very prolific in terms of taking companies public in New York and recently actually in London as well. About 20 IPOs last year, as Orna pointed out, about $10 billion in exit value, which was a great number. If you look at slide 24, you'll see that the total value of exits, both IPO and M&A, was more like $15 billion, okay, which is, again, a very nice ratio. When you look at $3.4 billion invested new into the tech market, $15 billion taken out, that's very good. And if you look at slide 25, you'll see something very dramatic, which is that the size of the average exit is increasing unbelievably. I mean, it's literally data that it's almost too good to be true, because back in 2008, it was an average of about $30 million an exit. Last year, we crested $200 million an exit, which is just astounding growth. So while we're still not creating enough Tevas, and we need to create these massive companies that have market caps of $50 billion, we're doing quite much better. I mean, we're no longer the little itty bitty $30 million companies, but getting up to a $200 million exit price, while I'd like to see them continue to grow in Israel, is better. And of course, the slide 24, 26, the emblematic company in that regard was Waze, which exited for $1 billion to Google, again, without having sold a dollar of anything to anybody. A good exit, stayed in Israel, at least as an R&D center. But if you look at slide 27, you'll see something actually rather interesting, which is in the last 2 years, there have been 10 nominally billion-dollar exits. And that is almost equivalent to the total number of those kinds of exits over the last decade. So in a 2-year period, $10 billion babies, both going public or getting bought. And so to say that Israel is really the little itty bitty startup nation isn't right anymore. The biggest one of the bunch on slide 28 was Mobileye, local hometown. I'm a Jerusalemite favorite. This company was very patient, had raised money for 15, 16 years, grew their business. They actually went public in the middle of the war, despite investment bank advice not to do so, and popped 50% on the first day of trading. On slide 29, you'll see again more detail about the 20 IPOs that happened. Of the top 10 performing IPOs last year on Wall Street, 3 were Israeli. Okay, they were CyberArk, Rewalk, and Mobileye. So it's not just that these were good size, but they were actually very well received by the capital markets. On slide 30, you'll see what Yossi was talking about relative to the serial entrepreneur phenomena. These larger companies that are being built are being driven by people who are not doing it for the first or second, and sometimes for the third time. These are people who basically, this is their job, which is to create new companies. So if a guy like Shlomo Kramer shows up in your office and you don't invest, something's wrong with you. okay? Because Shlomo has done basically three, billion-dollar companies, including one of the biggest company, in the country, which was Checkpoint. Victor Willens on slide 31, looks like a fun guy, and he is. And after his multi-billion-dollar exit earlier with Galileo, he sold another company to Amazon called Annapurna, which is going to be essentially the linchpin of Amazon's cloud services strategy from Silicon on up. Now, another critical factor on slide 32 is the presence now of private equity and growth equity finally coming to the country. It used to be that basically if you had a company that was doing $40 or $50 million a year, your options were either go public, a little early, or sell out. And now you have this third option, which the guys like KKR and TPG and Carlyle and Apex has been there for a while, and Silver Lake, they're all over the country, and they're writing checks of size. Now, on slide 33, you'll see the sort of typical customers who are buying the Israeli companies. It's basically a food fight. In Silicon Valley, people feel that Israel represents a great value in terms of buying companies cheaply. Slide 34, you'll see some of the data about these companies. That there are now 325 multinational R&D centers in the country, some of them very big, and they're a result of serial buying, because companies like Cisco have bought 13 companies, in Israel. EMC, Orna, how many of you guys bought?
12.
12 companies, giving them a neck-to-neck race. I mean, I've heard estimates, by the way, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that as much as 50% of your profits are derived from Israeli acquisitions or products.
No, that's for Intel. That's not for us, but we're coming close.
Okay, I mean, it's this, and so no one's calling EMC an Israeli company, but if you're coming close to half of your profits coming from Israel, this is a remarkable fact. And by the way, speaking of Intel, slide 35, Intel more than doubled down right after the war was over, literally 2 weeks after the war. They announced a $6 billion further investment to build a 10 nanometer fab. And what makes this, by the way, there's a funny story about some Intel guy was joking that they didn't get the deal they wanted. And I said, what do you mean? You got a $300 million grant, you got tax relief. And he said, no, we wanted that symbol of the state of Israel with the menorah. We wanted something to say Intel inside on the lower right side. Okay, but you look at slide 36, you see what's happening in the country relative to what I would call the rise of Asia-Israel. Literally, this was something that really didn't happen 10 years ago and even 5 years ago. But now, whether it's Samsung having made 8 investments in Israel last year, if you look at slide 37, you'll see people who have been in our offices from China in the last several months. There is a Chinese invasion, a very welcome invasion. We say Baruch haba, welcome to the country, but they're coming in droves and they're investing quite prolifically. If you look at slide 38, you'll see Mr. Li Ka-shing from Horizons Ventures. He has now, this by the way is out of date, he has now 29 investments in Israel with 16 in the US. And the areas that are driving this renaissance in Israel, if you will, I think bode very well for Israel long term. And that is that the stuff that we're good at, whether it's water or drones or robotics or big data or Internet of Things and certainly cybersecurity, these are the things people want to invest in today. So if you look today and say, how is Israel going to do over the next 5 or 10 years? I think with all those factors of the serial entrepreneurs, of the private equity, of the rise of Asia, and in particular, the world coming into our home court advantage, into our wheelhouse, that's very good. If you look, just skip, and I'm going to stop in just 2 more minutes about crowdfunding, because I promised Glenn, I'd rather sell Israel than my own company. I like my own company very much, and it's partly about selling Israel. But the idea here is as follows. How do people hook up to that story? Right? In other words, a lot of people now have discovered Israel, have read the book Startup Nation, have been there, have seen the vibrant investment and technology scene and say, I want to play. Well, if you're not a principal of a private equity or growth equity fund or a venture capital fund, or you're an angel with huge connections, basically you don't. So that's why I set up something called OurCrowd, which is a crowdfunding platform to basically hook up thousands of people to Israeli startups. And a funny thing happened is if you look at slide 43, we have now become the largest crowdfunding for equity platform in the world. And that's not just because I think we have a good team and we're doing a good job, but it's because we're selling Israel. It's because 80% of our investments, we just announced a 68th investment this week, are in Israel. and people want to connect to it. And we allow people for $10,000 to not get a T-shirt, but to actually get equity in a company. If you look at slide 44, what we like to do is to essentially bridge the worlds of angel investing and venture capital. We curate the whole process. We review the deals. We curate the investors. It's for accredited investors only. And we like to combine the best of those worlds. And if you just look at slide 45, and I'll stop with that. What we do is we research the best deals. We then, and we source about 2,000 plus a year. We then invest our own capital, and then we invite the crowd to join us. And if you look at slide 46, and that's the last one for sure, we have basically invested, as of this week, actually $120 million in Israel. To date, this year, our goal is to invest $120 million in the year. We'll be the biggest investor in Israel. And what's interesting is we're doing this without institutional funding, but it's coming from individuals, 8,000 individuals from 110 countries, and we're just getting started.